Mr. Mani Shankar Aiyar, thank you very much for taking a few minutes from a very busy and hectic schedule to talk to me. Um, I did send you a couple of questions in advance of our meeting, and I wonder if I could just walk through a few of those and get your reflections and impressions on these questions.
Certainly.
First, there's a lot of discussion now in the media and among the sort of chattering classes that India is emerged, or India is emerging as a world power. We're aspiring for a Security Council seat and all the rest of it. So I wonder, what is your take on this? Are we emerged? Are we emerging? Is the question itself irrelevant and premature because we've got so many domestic problems we haven't yet solved that it's presumptuous to even talk about being emerged or being emerging?
Well, it was President Obama who certified to us in the Central Hall of Parliament that we are no longer an emerging tadpole, but we are a fully emerged frog. Begging President Obama's pardon, I wonder whether this is the kind of illusion in which we should be covering ourselves. For the fact of the matter is that we are both emerged and submerged. There is a small segment of India's population which has fully emerged in the sense that it can hold its own with the elite of any country in the world, including that of the United States. At the same time, an overwhelming majority of Indians are well below the plimsoll line. And if we start thinking that we are an emerged power, then we will end up forgetting the submerged 7/8. Yes, I think the example of the iceberg is perhaps the most relevant one. And there is a danger of our Titanic hitting this iceberg if we don't see ourselves in perspective. For at the end of the day, it is not the certificates we receive from the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal which is going to determine our destiny, but how the people of India view their involvement, their participation, their share of the growth trajectory. So to put matters in perspective, on the one hand, there is simply no doubt that whereas we were growing at approximately 1% per annum, some experts have estimated it at less, and a few have estimated it slightly above that, but about 1% per annum in the half century leading to independence. In the immediate aftermath of independence, we were able to up that about 3 times or more to 3.5%. So although in today's perspective, 3.5% appears a very modest rate of growth, in the perspective of those who were the beneficiaries of this jump in Indian economic performance, it was a major change from colonial times. And then we raised this even further during the second 5-year plan, so that at the time that I was appearing for my BA Economics Honours examination, which coincided with the end of the second plan and the commencement of the third plan, we had Walter Rostow tell us that Norksay was wrong, that there isn't a vicious cycle of underdevelopment in which we are caught, but that there are stages of economic growth, and that there's a point at which you arrive where you take off like a rocket which has been fueled adequately and then has a takeoff stage, that the economy would take off and then we'd be out of underdevelopment. And the word then got invented some years later that there are developing economies as distinct from developed economies, whereas till Walter Rostow, we talked of underdeveloped economies and developed economies. Now, it was at that stage that Walter Rostow was asked, what is your example of a country which has arrived at the takeoff stage? And unhesitatingly, he pointed to India. So I do not denigrate what happened in the first 10 or 15 years of our independence. But then the decade of 1961-71 took over. It was politically a disastrous decade for us, for we were again and again at war. In 1961, we invaded Goa. We certainly had the satisfaction of overthrowing the Portuguese, but it also gave us the illusion of military power. It resulted almost immediately in 1962 in the forward policy in the Himalayas, for which we were ill-equipped, before the year was out, 1962, the Chinese had come right up to Assam and shown us up for our military weaknesses. Pakistan, which had been very careful about not taking us on after the initial war in Kashmir, then decided, especially under Mr. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, that the Indians were just as weak as they had been proved to be by Balban in the 12th century AD, or the 13th century AD. And the 1965 war started. It came in three phases. There was the operation in the Rann of Kutch, then there was Operation Gibraltar, and finally there was the September War. And it ended in a standoff. And then Bhutto did exactly what Hitler had done, said that the generals had betrayed him. So notwithstanding the Tashkent Agreement, he was gearing his country up for the second round of the same war. And that happened in 1971. And of course we had an overwhelming military victory. But in the process, the decade of 1961-71 got lost. And although it is generally attributed to the ills of the license permit Raj, the fact of the matter is that perhaps we would have had Rostov's takeoff if we hadn't had all these wars, which totally distorted the economy and the processes of economic growth. Then, during the experience of the 1970s, there was a realization that the economy was moving onto a completely different trajectory, that the parameters which had been true of the Indian economy till 1947 and then subsequently had in a significant sense changed. And therefore I would draw your attention to a brilliant little book by L.K. Jha called Economic Strategy for the 80s, written when Mrs. Gandhi was not in power. And it presaged Deng Xiaoping, it presaged Lee Kuan Yew, it presaged the process of removing the state from the commanding heights of the economy and allowing a private sector which had not hitherto existed, at least in significant numbers, to take over some of the controls of the economy while the state concentrated on the submerged 7/8. That was really the economic strategy of L.K. Jha. And so you see, in the 1980s itself, which was a decade before Manmohanomics, the economy booming onto a growth path of 5.6%, if you take the average over the 80s. In the first decade of reforms, on the other hand, the average annual rate of growth of GDP was only 5.9%. So we were only 0.3% ahead of the game. It's not till well into a decade of economic reforms, at a time when Greenspanomics is resulting in a boom all over the world, that the Indian economy also rises and rises and rises, reaches 9.4% in the golden year of 2007, and then, like the rest of the world, suffers a retreat. But whereas there's a collapse for the rest of the world, there's only a marginal retreat for the Indian economy. And over the last 2 or 3 years, I think the Indian economy has demonstrated a resilience which is matched only by the Chinese economy. And therefore, India looks set to overtake the Chinese rate of growth during the decade to come. And by about 2050, unless things go badly wrong, we could be in a situation which we have not enjoyed since the first quarter of the 18th century, of China and India really being the lead economies of the world. But, having said all this, I am deeply concerned by the fact that this shining India includes the largest number of illiterates perhaps anywhere in the world. We include malnutrition rates for children below 5 of about 47% being severely to moderately malnourished. 9 out of 10 pregnant Indian women are anemic. We add more hungry millions to the world's population every year than the rest of the world put together. And it has been estimated by Arjun Sen Gupta on the basis of the 2004 National Sample Survey measured against the 2001 population census, that in 2004, about 77% of the Indian population was consuming less than 20 rupees a day, which at the exchange rate is about 50 US cents a day, and which at purchasing power parity is approximately $2, a little less than $2 a day. Now, if you have an economy in which 77% or 839 million people then, and it's much closer to 1 billion people now, are living barely at a sustenance level, then you can hardly call such a country as an emerged country or an emerged economy. And there's been another very, very disturbing statistic that has come our way recently, that the UN Human Development Report says that in 1994, India stood at 134 on their league table. And 15 years later, after the central government increased outlays on social sector expenditure and anti-poverty programs by a factor of 15, we're still exactly where we were 15 years earlier, at position 134. And the latest report, which is based on a slightly different methodology, says that the position in 2010 is the same as it was in 2009. So economic reforms and the boom that has taken place has not really impacted in a positive or measurable manner on the lives of the people.
I wonder, sorry to interrupt, if I could bring you then to a question that's of great interest, which is there's now a lot of discussion of what the government is calling inclusive development, inclusive growth. Do you think this really amounts to a cliche? Where is the inclusiveness? Because the fixation seems to be on 9% growth or an aspiration of 10% growth. So what, if one sort of deconstructs this notion of inclusive development, what is that? What should that be? What should be the elements of that?
I think the intention is sincere, and it is emblazoned, this concept of inclusive growth is emblazoned in the archstone of the current 11th five-year plan. And the idea seems to be that since economic growth, economic reforms, which an essential component of which is tax reforms, has resulted in the generation of far more government revenue than ever in the past, and since a substantial portion of this enhanced revenue is being directed towards the social sectors and anti-poverty programs, the inclusive growth means that we spend more and more and more money on social sector programs and anti-poverty programs. But are outlays commensurate with outcomes? If we increase expenditure by 15 times and remain exactly where we were, then we are in the position of Alice in Wonderland. We're running faster and faster to remain exactly where we are. So there's clearly an inadequacy, that inclusive growth is not going to be obtained by simply spending more and more money on projects that are essentially meant for the poor. It can only come about, inclusive growth, through inclusive governance. And the mechanisms for inclusive governance were envisaged by Mahatma Gandhi before independence. They were given legal shape by Jawaharlal Nehru, but it still didn't work. And so Rajiv Gandhi gave it constitutional sanction, constitutional status, and constitutional sanctity. This was the Panchayati Raj system. Now we have the shell. There's simply no doubt that we've had election after election in the last 18 years in our local bodies. They're established just everywhere in the country, except where we've deliberately said it will be exempted. But where it's exempted, there are other forms of local self-government. We have approximately 250,000 units of local self-government across the country, to which we've elected 3.2 million representatives. Now that's almost the population of New Zealand or Norway. And of these 3.2 million, as of now, there are 1.2 million women. And because we're going to raise reservations to 50% imminently, that number will go up to something between 1.6 and 1.8 million. Now, of whom 86,000 hold office as chairman or chairperson or vice chairperson of their respective local units. There are more elected women in India alone than in the rest of the world put together. This is political and social empowerment on a scale that is without precedent in history or parallel in the world. What we ought to be doing is utilizing this vast network of local self-government to promote neighborhood development, to deal with issues which are intimately connected with the daily lives of people. Access to food, entitlements. Access to potable water, entitlements. Access to primary education as an entitlement. Access to primary health care as an entitlement. Primary to minor irrigation works as an entitlement. Access to village roads as an entitlement. Why do I say as an entitlement? Because unless you are entitled to these things, and it's not a question of charity from above, and unless you say that I have a right to all this, it's entirely likely that the benevolent delivery mechanism will prove to be not so benevolent after all. Now that's happened in the case of India. For 6 decades, we've been relying upon our bureaucracy and our technocracy to deliver desperately needed public goods and public services to the people at large. It's not reaching them. Or if it is, it's reaching them in very inadequate measure. Rajiv Gandhi made an estimate. It became notorious that 85 paise in the rupee is not reaching the beneficiaries in these programs. Kirit Parekh, who was a member of the Planning Commission till a few years ago, he's made an independent estimate. And he says, no, Rajiv Gandhi is completely wrong. It's not 85 paise in the rupee that goes into administrative expenses, legitimate administrative expenses. It's 83 paise in the rupee. Now the Prime Minister, who's a well-known economist, says he thinks that's an exaggeration. It might be. But at any rate, we know that something like 3/4 of the budgets are being spent by the administration on themselves. Of the 200 or 300 centrally sponsored schemes, each one has its own delivery silo. And therefore there's absolutely no convergence possible at the bottom.
And clearly a waste of resources.
It's a complete waste of resources. If we could, instead of this, just empower the local bodies with functions, finances, and functionaries to be able to do for themselves what is now being done for them, even if there's inefficiency, which there's bound to be, and even if there's corruption, which again there is bound to be, I doubt that more than 25 paise in the rupee will get wasted. 75 paise will reach the people if we give it to them through the people's representatives. Whereas we now know that something like 10 or 15 paise in the rupee is reaching the people through this apparently benevolent and impartial delivery system of the bureaucracy and the technocracy.
I wonder if, because I'm also noticing the clock, if we can conclude with if you were to be looking in your crystal ball, or you're looking at your projections for the future, what do you think is the principal challenge for India developmentally? Is it the challenge of Maoism? Is it the challenge that you've talked about, which is a lack of public goods and services? What's the key challenge, and what would you say is the one essential thing that we have to do if we're going to keep ourselves on a good growth trajectory, but maintain social cohesion without rampant inequality and rampant corruption that we seem to be witnessing at the moment?
Well, with your permission, 1 or 2 aphorisms, and we may find what is the challenge. First, let us recognize that India is prospering, Indians are not. Therefore, it's essential to bring Indians, the people of India, onto this growth trajectory. That's number one. Second, an axiom of independent India's development path is under serious challenge. The axiom being that development is desirable. Those who have fallen off the growth trajectory are saying far from being desirable, development is disruptive. And because we are a full-fledged democracy, We have created a class consciousness over the last 65 years, which is now being expressed in 1/3 of the districts of India in terms of insurgency, and in the rest of the country in terms of anti-incumbency. The people of India are not satisfied. And I don't see how we can sustain our democracy unless we can give a measure of satisfaction to the people. And I don't see how we can sustain our development path unless democracy and development make people feel that they are participating in the growth process. Now, both of these can be assured through a process of grassroots development, through grassroots democracy. So what's the answer? The answer is simple and it's ready-made. We already have the institutions and the people and the constitutional framework and the laws in terms of which we can provide grassroots development through grassroots democracy. The point is to operationalize it. I think the states cannot be more than persuaded. That's the best we can do, because the Constitution doesn't permit us to interfere with states' rights beyond a point. But because something like 75% of development funds come from the center, and in some states of India it's as high as 90%, and all these funds are channeled through what are called centrally sponsored schemes, which have guidelines, we only have to ensure that the guidelines provide for the funds, functions and functionaries relating to any one scheme to be devolved right down to the grassroots where these institutions exist. We do that, we don't need any more money. We'll just be spending it more efficiently. And at the same time, it won't affect your growth rates. If, however, there is at any point a serious clash of interests between the economic growth rate and social justice, I think invariably we must allow social justice to prevail. In other words, there should be no obsession with the growth rate. We cannot have a situation in which we eye only the growth rate and say that we needn't concern ourselves with the immediate social consequences of development, because those will take care of themselves over the long run. In this particular case, we must remember that Keynes was wrong. It's not only in the long run that we're all dead, but that very often in the medium run we're all dead, and that most of us, especially in a democracy that goes to the polls every 5 years, does not have more than 5 years within which to rectify social injustice. Otherwise, there's dissatisfaction among the people. And if this dissatisfaction persists over time, who knows that 1/3 of the districts of India under insurgency might turn into 1/2 of the country under insurgency. And once that insurgency starts licking the urban centers, then we may be preparing ourselves for India 1789. God forbid that this happen. But for us to be complacent and say, no, Barack Obama has said that we are an emerged country and all we have to look to is 2050 when we'll be a great power in the world. I think it is this kind of delusion which is the biggest danger, so long as we look reality in the face and so long as we understand the Gandhian slogan, which is our national slogan, Satyameva Jayate, the truth will always prevail. Let's just look at the reality and cater to that reality instead of having dreams of being a super economic power, which we just cannot be, with poverty staring us in the manner in which, the obscene manner in which it stares us in the face.
Mani Shankar Aiyar, always provocative and always thought-provoking. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.